Commander Vexai floated in his biochamber, deep within the Galactic Observer Corps headquarters. His translucent tentacles wrapped around a steaming cup of nutrient fluid. The massive space station orbited the neutral world of Sanctum Prime, where representatives from 47 different species worked together to maintain peace across the galaxy. But today, peace was the last thing on anyone's mind. The holographic display flickered to life in front of him, showing 3 separate star systems marked with ominous red warnings. Each one represented a military disaster that had left the galaxies. Most powerful civilizations, scratching their heads in confusion. Vexai had seen plenty of battle reports in his 73 years as an observer, but these files made his bioluminescent patches dim with concern. Impossible, he muttered in his native tongue, watching footage of human soldiers charging through plasma fire that should have reduced them to ash. The humans moved with a reckless determination that defied every military doctrine he had studied. The comm system crackled to life, and Admiral Corthus's deep voice filled the chamber. The Thalorian admiral commanded respect throughout the galaxy, his forearms having led countless successful campaigns during the sector wars. Vexai, I know you're reviewing the files. What's your initial assessment? Vexai's stock swiveled toward the communication panel. Admiral, with respect, these reports must contain errors. No species fights like this and survives. A low rumble that might have been laughter came through the speakers. That's exactly why this assignment goes to you, Observer. The Council needs answers, and they need them yesterday. How do these primitive humans keep winning battles they should lose? The first hologram zoomed in on Kepler-4 for it to be a mining world on the edge of Vorthok space. The planet's red surface was scarred with massive excavation sites where rare crystals were extracted for starship fuel. Lieutenant Kim Daeho's personnel file appeared beside the planetary data. 28 years old, born on Earth's moon colonies, commissioned officer for only 3 years. On paper, he looked like any other junior military leader, but the combat footage told a different story. Kim Dae-ho had taken command of the 42nd Human Expeditionary Force when their colonel was killed in the first hour of fighting. Faced with 3,000 Vorthok raiders, evacuation. Instead, Kim Dae-ho had ordered his 400 soldiers to dig in and fight. The Vorthok were nightmare creatures from the galaxy's perspective. Their crystalline bodies could withstand direct hits from most energy weapons and their plasma. Technology could melt through reinforced armor plating like a hot knife through butter. They had conquered 12 star systems in the past decade, leaving behind nothing but glowing craters where cities once stood. Yet somehow, Kim Dae-ho's small force had not only survived the initial assault, but had actually driven the raiders off-world. The casualty reports made no sense. Human losses were surprisingly light, while Vorthok casualties were catastrophic. The second display showed Station Omega-7, a massive military installation that served as the gateway to the inner colonies. Captain Park Min-seok had been holding the station against the Hegemony fleet for 3 months. The Hegemony was the galaxy's most technologically advanced civilization. Their ships equipped with weapons that could crack planets. Their standard siege doctrine involved surrounding a target and bombarding it until surrender became the only logical option. No species in galactic history had ever maintained defensive positions against a Hegemony siege for longer than 2 weeks. The mathematical models were clear. Supplies would run out, morale would collapse, and rational commanders would negotiate surrender to save lives. But Park Min-seok wasn't following the mathematical models. Intelligence reports suggested that the human captain was actually expanding his defensive perimeters and launching counterattacks against Hegemony positions. His troops were not only surviving the siege, but seemed to be enjoying it. Morale reports indicated the humans were telling jokes, singing songs, and maintaining what they called esprit de corps, even as plasma bombardments shook their station. Daily, the third assignment made Vexai's nutrient fluid taste bitter. Sergeant Lee Hunna led a 12-person special operations team that had been operating behind enemy lines in Hegemony space for 2 months. Their mission parameters were classified above Vex-High's clearance level. But the casualty reports from hegemony forces in that sector painted a disturbing picture. Entire hegemony outposts were going silent. Supply convoys were disappearing without distress calls. Its most unsettling were the survivor reports describing humans who seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating effectiveness, and vanish like ghosts. The hegemony's best tracking technology couldn't locate them, and their most sophisticated battle algorithms couldn't predict their movements. What made it worse were the medical reports. Hegemony soldiers who survived encounters with Lee Hana's team reported that the humans had provided medical aid to wounded enemies before disappearing. This contradiction baffled military analysts across the galaxy. Why show mercy to enemies you are actively trying to kill? Vex-High had built his reputation on understanding military behavior through logic and precedent. His reports on the Zephyrian hive mind swarm tactics had helped end the Pollux rebellion. His analysis of Crystalline Legion battle formations had saved 3 star systems during the Outer Rim Wars. He approached warfare like a mathematical equation with predictable variables and logical outcomes. But humans seemed to operate outside these parameters. They made decisions that defied tactical sense, maintained morale in impossible situations, and achieved victories through methods that should have guaranteed defeat. Every species he had studied followed predictable patterns based on survival, instincts, resource management, and rational risk assessment. Humans appeared to ignore all 3 concepts. The transport vessel Seeker of Truth was already prepared for departure, its quantum drives humming with contained energy. The ship was specifically designed for observation missions, equipped with advanced stealth systems and recording equipment that could capture battlefield data from safe distances. Vex-High had used it to document conflicts across the galaxy, always maintaining the neutral observer status that kept him alive in war zones. As he sealed his biochamber for transport, Vex-High reviewed his previous reports one final time. 14 different species, 47 major conflicts, and hundreds of minor skirmishes. Every single report had followed the same basic pattern: superior technology in numbers, determined outcomes. Commanders made logical decisions based on available data, and warfare followed predictable mathematical models. He expected his human observations to fit the same template. Perhaps they had developed some new weapon technology that intelligence reports had missed. Maybe their tactical computers used different algorithms that gave them temporary advantages. There had to be a logical explanation for their seemingly impossible victories. The Seeker of Truth shuddered slightly as its quantum drives engaged, tearing a hole in space-time that would carry them toward Kepler 4-4 to be in just under 72 hours. Vex-High settled into his observation alcove, his recording devices automatically calibrating to capture every detail of human combat behavior. Through the viewport, stars stretched into brilliant lines as they entered hyperspace. Somewhere ahead lay answers to questions that were keeping the galaxy's military strategists awake at night. Within 3 days, Vex-High would witness his first human battle and begin to understand why these peculiar bipedal creatures were rewriting the rules of warfare. The journey through hyperspace gave him time to study the classified files in greater detail, but the more he read, the more confused he became. Humans seemed to break every established military principle while somehow achieving victory after victory. It was as if they were playing an entirely different game with rules no one else understood. Soon, he would learn that the rules weren't different at all. The humans had simply discovered something that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten in their pursuit of logical, efficient warfare. They remembered that behind every weapon, every strategy, and every battle plan stood individuals who could choose to be more than the sum of their programming. The stars streaked past, carrying him toward revelations that would change everything. He thought he knew about war, peace, and the strange species called humanity. The red dust of Kepler 442b swirled around the mining colony like a crimson fog, kicked up by the massive excavation machines that never stopped working.
Vex-High adjusted
His observation dome's filters as he watched the human settlement spread out below him. The colony looked like a collection of metal boxes scattered across the planet's harsh surface. connected by covered walkways that protected against the constant dust storms. From his hidden position on the ridge overlooking the valley, High could see everything through his advanced recording equipment. The main command center sat in the middle of the settlement, surrounded by living quarters, supply depots, and the massive mining operations that made this world valuable. 2,000 civilian miners worked alongside 400 military personnel, all of them seemingly unaware that death was approaching from the stars above. Lieutenant Kim Dae-ho stood inside the command center, his young face illuminated by the blue glow of tactical displays. At 28, he looked barely old enough to command a patrol unit, let alone defend an entire colony. His dark hair was already showing streaks of premature gray from the stress of frontier command, and his uniform bore the dust stains that marked everyone who lived on. Kepler-442b. The tactical displays told a terrifying story. 3,000 Vorthok raiders were descending from orbit in their crystalline ships, each vessel gleaming like a deadly jewel against the red sky. The Vorthok were among the most feared warriors in the galaxy, their bodies made of living crystal that could absorb most energy weapons and reflect them back at their enemies. Their plasma technology had burned entire cities to ash on a dozen worlds. "Sir, incoming transmission from the lead Vorthok vessel," reported Corporal Shinbora from her position at the communications console. She was barely 22, fresh from the military academy on Earth, and her hands trembled slightly as she worked the controls. The main screen flickered to life, showing the angular face of a Vorthok war leader, its crystalline features reflected. Light in strange patterns, and when it spoke, its voice sounded like breaking glass. "Human colony, you are surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender now, and we will allow non-combatants to evacuate. Resist, and we will turn your settlement into a crater." Kim Dae-ho didn't even look up from his tactical displays. "Tell them we're busy," he said casually. As if the Vorthok commander had asked about the weather, Corporal Shinbora stared at him in disbelief. "Sir, did you want to negotiate terms, or ... "No terms," Kim Dae-ho replied, finally looking up with a slight smile. "We've got mining quotas to meet, and these Vorthok are interfering with our work schedule." Vexhi's recording equipment captured every word, every expression, every seemingly insane decision the humans were making. According to every military manual in the galactic database, Kim Dae-ho should have been requesting immediate evacuation or negotiating surrender terms. Instead, he was treating the approaching invasion like it was a minor inconvenience. The first Vorthok dropships screamed through the atmosphere like falling meteors, their crystalline hulls glowing red-hot from atmospheric entry. They landed in perfect formation around the colony's perimeter, disgorging hundreds of crystal warriors who immediately began advancing with their plasma weapons charged and ready. The human response was equally immediate, but completely unexpected. Instead of falling back to prepared defensive positions, small teams of soldiers scattered throughout the colony and began what could only be described as controlled chaos. Sergeant Yoon Tamin led a squad of minor stern soldiers to the colony's eastern edge, where the Vorthok advance was strongest. As plasma bolts began carving through the outer defensive barriers, Yoon made an observation that would change the entire battle. The constant dust storms that plagued Kepler-442b were interfering with the Vorthok weapons, causing their normally precise plasma streams to disperse and lose effectiveness. "Mining charges now," Yoon shouted to his squad. Within minutes, controlled explosions were sending massive clouds of red dust into the air, creating an artificial dust storm that turned the Vorthok's technological advantage into a liability. Their plasma weapons became nearly useless in the thick, swirling clouds, while the humans simply switched to conventional projectile weapons that worked perfectly fine in the dusty conditions. Meanwhile, Private First Class Kong Ji-woo was demonstrating why human resourcefulness had become legendary throughout the galaxy. At 19, he was the youngest soldier in the colony's defense force. But he was also the nephew of one of the settlement's original miners. While the Vorthok focused their assault on the obvious defensive positions, Kong was crawling through maintenance tunnels and ventilation shafts that honeycombed the entire colony. His commanders had no idea these passages even existed. But Kong had spent his childhood exploring every hidden corner of the settlement during family visits. Now those childhood adventures were about to save lives, emerging from a ventilation grate directly behind 3 Vorthok plasma cannon positions. Kong methodically disabled each weapon with mining explosives he had grabbed from a supply depot. Vorthok warriors never saw him coming. One moment their heavy weapons were pounding the human defensive lines. The next moment their cannons were smoking ruins. Kong disappeared back into the tunnel system before the confused Vorthok could even figure out what had happened. Similar scenes played out across the colony as human defenders turned every disadvantage into an opportunity. The miners knew their workplace better than any invading force could, and the soldiers adapted their tactics faster than the Vorthok could respond. Improvised weapons appeared everywhere as humans used mining equipment, construction tools, and even kitchen utensils to create effective weapons against their crystalline enemies. The battle raged for 6 hours, turning the orderly Vorthok assault into a confused nightmare of dust, explosions, and human ingenuity. Vexai watched in amazement as the humans seemed to multiply their effectiveness through sheer creativity and stubborn determination. They didn't have better weapons or superior numbers, but they refused to fight the battle their enemies expected. When the dust finally settled, literally and figuratively, the results defied every military prediction model in the galactic database. The Vorthok fleet was retreating toward orbit with 70% casualties, their crystalline bodies leaving glittering fragments across the red landscape. Human losses numbered 43 killed and 86 wounded, a fraction of what should have been total annihilation. But what happened next disturbed Vexai more than the battle itself. As human medics moved through the battlefield, treating their own wounded, Lieutenant Kim Dae-ho personally lifted an injured Vorthok raider and carried the crystal being toward the medical facility. The enemy warrior's arm had been shattered. Leaking the luminous fluid that served as Vorthok blood, Lieutenant Vexai called out, his universal translator struggling to convey his confusion. "Why are you helping the enemy wounded?" Kim Dae-ho paused, looking down at the Vorthok warrior in his arms. The crystal being was unconscious, its normally fierce features peaceful in its injured state. "Because he's hurt," the human officer replied simply, as if this explained everything. In the medical bay, Vexai watched human doctors working alongside veterinarians and even mining engineers to treat Vorthok injuries. They had no training in crystalline biology, but they improvised solutions using mining equipment to stabilize fractures and industrial adhesives to seal cracks in damaged crystal skin. The captured Vorthok warriors watched in obvious confusion, as their enemies provided medical care, food, and even entertainment in the form of human music played over the facility's speaker system. Several Vorthok commented that they had never experienced such treatment from any species, including their own allies. That evening, the colony held memorial services for both human and Vorthok dead. Kim Dae-ho spoke about the human soldiers who had given their lives defending the colony, while also acknowledging the Vorthok warriors who had died far from their homeworld. He even invited the captured Vorthok to share stories about their fallen comrades, an offer that several of the crystal beings accepted with obvious surprise, as supply ships began arriving from nearby human colonies. Vexai observed something unprecedented. The humans were already sharing their food supplies with the captured raiders, planning reconstruction projects to repair battle damage, and organizing cultural exchange programs between human miners and Vorthok prisoners. Within 24 hours, 3 captured Vorthok warriors had volunteered to help with mining operations, claiming they found human engineering techniques fascinating. 2 human miners had started learning basic Vorthok crystal shaping techniques, describing it as the coolest art form in the galaxy. Vexai's recording equipment had captured thousands of hours of footage, detailed biological scans, and comprehensive tactical analysis. But when he sat down to compile his preliminary report to the Galactic Council, he found himself staring at a blank communication screen for nearly an hour. Every military doctrine he had studied suggested that the humans should have been wiped out in the first 20 minutes of combat. Every psychological profile in the galactic database indicated that species either fought with ruthless efficiency or showed mercy to defeated enemies. Never both simultaneously. Every strategic analysis concluded that weaker forces should retreat. When facing superior numbers and technology, the humans had ignored every rule and somehow achieved total victory while maintaining their apparent humanity. They had fought like warriors and acted like healers, shown tactical brilliance and emotional compassion, demonstrated lethal effectiveness and genuine mercy, all within the same 6-hour period. Finally, HFY transmitted a single line to his superiors: require additional observation time. Initial assumptions proving inadequate. But privately, as he watched human children playing games with young Vorthok captives in the colony's recreation area, HFY wondered if his assumptions had been more than inadequate. They might have been completely wrong about what warfare actually meant and what victory actually looked like. The red dust of Kepler-4 for to be continued to swirl around the mining colony. But now it carried something new in its particles, the scent of change, that would eventually reach every corner of the galaxy. Station Omega-7 hung in the void like a wounded giant, its massive bulk scarred by 3 months of constant bombardment. The orbital fortress was one of humanity's most important military installations, guarding the hyperspace routes to the inner colonies. Its titanium steel hull gleamed dully under the light of the system's twin suns. While debris from destroyed ships drifted around it like a metal graveyard, HFY pressed his face against the observation port, watching another wave of hegemony plasma torpedoes streak toward the station. The enemy fleet surrounded Omega-7 like a pack of predators, their sleek black ships bristling with weapons that could crack planets. 12,000 of the galaxy's most elite soldiers were out there, supported by orbital bombardment platforms that fired continuously around the clock. Inside the station's central hub, Captain Park Minseok stood before a holographic display showing the tactical situation. At 35, he looked older than his years, his face lined with the stress of command, and his uniform bearing the patches and repairs that marked everyone living under siege conditions. The display showed red dots everywhere, representing hegemony forces that outnumbered his defenders 15-1. Captain, another breach in Section 7, reported Lieutenant Song Woo-jin from the damage control station. Hull integrity down to 60% in that area. Park Min-seok nodded calmly, as if discussing the weather. Seal it with emergency bulkheads and reroute life support through the backup systems. How are we doing on medical supplies? Still adequate, sir. Dr. Kim says she can keep treating wounded for another month at current casualty rates. Another massive explosion shook the station, sending tremors through the deck plating. Emergency lighting flickered as power systems struggled to compensate for damaged generators. Somewhere in the distance, hull breach alarms wailed their mechanical warnings. But the humans went about their duties with practiced efficiency. HFY's recording equipment captured every detail as he followed Park Min-seok through the station's corridors. What he saw defied every principle of siege warfare. By all mathematical models, Station Omega-7 should have surrendered after the first week when food supplies began running low. By the second week, when the hegemony's psychological warfare broadcasts promised safe passage for surrendering personnel, evacuation should have been the only logical choice. But instead of despair, HFY found something he had never encountered. In 73 years of observing military conflicts, in Section C, which had taken 3 direct hits from plasma torpedoes, Corporal Lee Yoon-ji was sitting cross-legged on the deck, surrounded by a dozen refugee children. Their families had been evacuated from frontier colonies ahead of the hegemony advance, and now they were trapped on the station with everyone else. Old MacDonald had a farm, Leon-ji sang in her clear voice, while the children clapped along enthusiastically. E-I-E-I-O. The words echoed strangely in the damaged section, mixing with the distant sounds of weapons fire and damage control teams working to repair hull breaches. A hegemony plasma blast struck the section's outer hull, causing the deck to shudder violently. The children looked worried, but Lee Yoon-ji simply smiled and started the next verse. And on that farm he had some chickens. Yahoo! Why do they still hope? HFY asked Captain Park, during a brief lull in the bombardment. They were standing in the station's command center, surrounded by tactical displays showing the hopeless situation. Park Min-seok was reviewing defensive positions on one screen while simultaneously using another terminal to approve a requisition request. Vexai noticed it was for art supplies, paint, and musical instruments. "Hope," the captain replied, looking genuinely puzzled. "We're not hoping, Observer. We're waiting." "Waiting for what? For the 7th Fleet to finish their current operation and come get us?" Park Min-seok spoke matter-of-factly, as if this was the most obvious thing in the galaxy. The mathematical impossibility hit Vexai like a physical blow. His tentacles curled in distress as he accessed the galactic communication networks through his portable data terminal. The 7th Fleet was indeed engaged in combat operations, but they were 3 sectors away fighting a major hegemony offensive. Even if they achieved total victory, they couldn't possibly reach Station Omega-7 for at least 6 months. More likely, they would never come at all. Yet the humans continued their daily routines as if rescue was guaranteed. In Hydroponics Bay 3, Private Cho Soo-jin tended a small garden she had created using seeds from the station's emergency food supplies. Tomatoes, lettuce, and herbs grew under artificial lighting, creating a splash of green life in the sterile, metal environment. She shared the fresh vegetables with anyone who asked, treating her tiny garden like it was the most important place on the station. "How can you waste food resources on decoration?" Vexai asked her during one of his observation rounds. Soo-jin looked up from watering her plants, dirt smudged on her cheek. "It's not decoration," she said simply. "It's hope." What? When people see something growing, they remember there's still life in the universe. The recreation deck should have been converted to emergency medical facilities or ammunition storage weeks ago. But instead, it hosted Sergeant Kim Hyun-woo's evening poetry readings. Every night at 1900 hours, anyone who wanted to could gather in the damaged compartment and listen to readings from classical literature, original poems written by station personnel, stories about home. Vexai attended one of these sessions during his 2nd week of observation. The recreation deck had taken 3 direct hits from plasma torpedoes, leaving twisted metal and emergency patches covering holes in the bulkheads. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows across the gathering of 30 humans who sat on makeshift benches made from supply crates. Sergeant Kim Hyun-woo stood at the front, reading from a worn book of poetry. His voice carried clearly through the damaged space as he recited verses about Earth's ancient mountains and oceans that most of these people had never seen. When he finished, a young private read an original poem about her grandmother's cooking, which made several people wipe tears from their eyes. The worst bombardment yet began during Vexai's 3rd week of observation. The hegemony had brought up their heavy siege platforms, massive weapons that could punch through the station's armored hull like paper. For 6 straight hours, Omega-7 shook under the constant impacts as emergency teams raced to seal hull breaches and prevent catastrophic decompression. Vexai found himself huddled in a supply closet with Staff Sergeant Jang, Myung, and 5 junior enlisted personnel as the bombardment reached its peak. The small space was cramped and uncomfortable, with barely enough room for everyone to sit. Outside, the sounds of destruction were deafening as the station's superstructure groaned under the assault. Instead of panic or despair, Vexai witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about sentient behavior under extreme stress. Jang Mi-young, a veteran of 15 years of military service, began telling jokes. "So this hegemony commander walks into a bar?" she began, her voice somehow carrying over the noise of exploding ordnance. The bartender looks at him and says, "Why the long face?" The commander replies, "I've been trying to capture a human space station for 3 months, and they keep offering me recipe exchanges and poetry readings." The junior personnel actually laughed, their tension visibly reducing as Jang Mi-young continued with an endless stream of humor. She told stories about incompetent officers from her past assignments, made puns about military food that was supposedly worse than siege rations, and even managed to find comedy in their current desperate situation. Private Nam Jun-ho asked during a brief, quiet moment between explosions, Do you think they'll remember us when this is over? Jang Myong was checking her weapon, making sure it was ready for action if the hegemony breached their section. Kid, she replied with absolute confidence. They'll remember we held the line. That's what matters. The siege continued day after day, with human casualties mounting steadily, but morale somehow remaining stable. Vexa documented medical personnel who worked 8-hour shifts treating wounded soldiers, then spent their off-duty time teaching alien languages to refugee children, recorded engineers who repaired battle damage during bombardments, then used their free time to create art installations from twisted metal debris. Most disturbing of all, he observed Captain Park Min-seok maintaining normal administrative routines as if the station wasn't under constant attack. The captain held regular staff meetings, filed routine reports with distant headquarters, and even approved leave requests for personnel whose relief wouldn't arrive for months. On day 127 of the siege, Vexa was in the command center when the sensors detected multiple hyperspace signatures at the edge of the system. Captain Park looked up from a data pad where he was approving next month's duty roster, showing no surprise at all. "That'll be the 7th Fleet," he said calmly. "Right on schedule." The relief force that emerged from hyperspace was magnificent, consisting of 23 human warships led by the battlecruiser Indomitable. But what amazed Vexa wasn't the arrival of reinforcements. It was the fact that Park Min-seok had been approving duty assignments for the following month, as if he had never doubted they would survive to see it. The final battle lasted only 4 hours as the combined forces of the 7th Fleet and Station Omega-7's defenders caught the hegemony siege force between them. The enemy fleet, already weakened by months of grinding siege warfare, broke and retreated toward neutral space. The casualty reports told a story that would be studied in military academies for generations. Station Omega-7 had lost 342 personnel killed and 1,847 wounded during the 127-day siege. The attacking hegemony forces had suffered over 8,000 casualties, trying to take a position that should have fallen in the first week, but the numbers didn't tell the real story. As Vexa watched the reunion between the 7th Fleet personnel and the station's defenders, he saw something unprecedented in galactic military history. The humans weren't just celebrating survival. They were celebrating the fact that they had maintained their humanity throughout an ordeal that should have broken their spirits. Children who had spent 4 months under bombardment were showing off artwork they had created from debris. Soldiers who had fought desperate battles every day were sharing poems they had written during the siege. Medical personnel who had worked miracles with limited supplies were already planning improvements to the station's medical facilities. When Hai sat down to compile his second report to the Galactic Council, he found himself facing a document filled entirely with questions. How do you quantify hope in a military analysis? How do you measure the tactical value of poetry readings in vegetable gardens? How do you explain a species that treats siege warfare like a temporary inconvenience rather than a death sentence? The humans had violated every principle of rational military behavior, yet they had achieved what no other species in galactic history had managed. They had turned a hopeless defensive position into a symbol of resistance that would inspire human forces across the galaxy. As Station Omega-7 began the long process of repair and reconstruction, Vexa realized his observations were revealing something far more significant than unusual military tactics. The humans weren't just fighting wars differently. They were demonstrating an entirely new way of thinking about survival, community, and what it meant to be truly alive in a hostile universe. His report to the Galactic Council would contain only questions because the humans had challenged every assumption about what was possible when facing impossible odds. The forests of Hegemony Prime stretched endlessly in all directions, their twisted black trees reaching toward a purple sky like skeletal fingers. Vexa crouched behind a fallen log, his adaptive camouflage shifting to match the dark bark around him. Somewhere ahead, 12 human soldiers were preparing to infiltrate the most heavily defended military installation in this sector of the galaxy. Sergeant Lee Hana moved through the underbrush like a ghost, her movements so silent that even Vexai's enhanced hearing couldn't detect her approach. At 31, she was a veteran of countless special operations missions. Her face, bearing the kind of calm confidence that came from surviving situations where others had died. Her team followed her with the same deadly quiet, each soldier carrying enough firepower to level a small building. The hegemony supply depot rose from the forest floor, like a metallic mountain, its armored walls bristling with automated defense systems and sensor arrays. Energy shields flickered around the perimeter, creating a barely visible barrier that could vaporize anything trying to pass through without proper authorization codes. Guard towers dotted the facility's walls, each one manned by hegemony. Soldiers armed with plasma rifles that could cut through military armor like paper, intelligence reports indicated the depot contained supply reserves worth billions of galactic credits, enough ammunition and equipment to support 3 entire hegemony battle groups for 6 months. Destroying it would cripple enemy operations across 4 star systems and potentially save hundreds of thousands of human lives on frontier colonies. Target acquired, whispered specialist Kim Jun-soo through the team's communication network. The demolitions expert was studying the depot's structure through high-powered binoculars, identifying weak points where precisely placed charges could bring down the entire facility. I count 47 guards on the perimeter, plus automated defenses. Corporal Han Da-yoon was busy assembling the special explosives they would need for the mission. Each charge was no bigger than a dinner plate but contained enough destructive power to punch through reinforced military armor. She worked with the focused precision of someone who knew that a single mistake could kill her entire team. The insertion had taken them 3 days of careful movement through enemy territory. Avoiding patrol routes and sensor sweeps while carrying enough equipment to complete their mission, Vexai had accompanied them through it all, his recording devices capturing every detail of human special operations tactics. On the second day of their approach, they discovered something that changed everything. A hegemony transport ship had crashed in a clearing about 2 kilometers from their target, apparently shot down by automated defense systems that had mistaken it for an attacking vessel. The ship's hull was split open like a broken egg, with debris scattered across the forest floor. Survivors reported privately Sunjo, who had been scouting ahead, at least 6 hegemony personnel, 2 of them in critical condition. Lee. Hana called a halt to their advance, gathering her team in a defensive perimeter around the crash site. This was the moment when Vex High expected to see typical military behavior: either eliminate potential witnesses or bypass the situation, entirely to maintain operational security. Instead, he watched something that defied every principle of logical warfare. While Kim, Yun-soo, and Han Dae-yoon continued preparing their explosive charges for the primary mission, Lee Sung-ho and Private First Class Park The-gin immediately began providing medical aid to the wounded hegemony soldiers. They used their own medical supplies, water rations, and even emergency food to treat enemies who would have killed them without hesitation if the situation were reversed. This compromises operational security, Vexa observed, his recording equipment capturing every detail of the human's inexplicable behavior. So does leaving sentient beings to die, Lee Hana replied simply. Injured hegemony officer to a shaded area beneath the wreckage. Sharing water from her own canteen with someone who wore the uniform of her enemy, the wounded hegemony officer was a young female with the distinctive blue-tinted skin of her species. Her leg was badly broken, and she was suffering from severe dehydration after being trapped in the wreckage for 2 days.
Yes.
She stared at Lee Hana with obvious confusion, unable to understand why a human soldier was treating her wounds instead of interrogating her for intelligence. Why help me? The hegemony officer asked in broken standard galactic, her voice weak from pain and exhaustion. Because you're hurt? Lee Hana answered, using field medical techniques to stabilize the broken leg. That's reason enough. The contradiction became more apparent as the mission progressed. These same humans who were showing genuine compassion, 4 individual enemies were simultaneously planning an assault that would destroy supplies critical to thousands of hegemony troops. They were capable of both mercy and ruthlessness, often in the same moment. On the 3rd night, as they prepared for their final approach to the target, Vexa witnessed something that would haunt his understanding of human psychology forever. While Private Nam Su Ben maintained watch for enemy patrols, Lihana sat by their small camp stove, writing letters by hand on actual paper. But these weren't military reports or tactical assessments. Vexai's translation systems revealed they were personal messages to the families of hegemony soldiers. Written in carefully practiced hegemony script, she was explaining that their loved ones had been treated with dignity and respect, even in death. "Why are you doing this?" Vexai asked, genuinely confused by behavior that seemed to serve no tactical purpose. Lihana looked up from her writing, her face illuminated by the camp stove's blue flame. "Because someone should know," she replied. "Simply, if I die tomorrow, I'd want my family to know that whoever killed me at least recognized I was a person, not just a target." She sealed the letters in waterproof containers that would survive almost any environmental conditions, planning to leave them where hegemony search teams would eventually find them. The fact that she was taking time to honor dead enemies while preparing to kill more enemies tomorrow seemed like a contradiction that should have torn her apart psychologically. The assault on the depot began at 0347 local time during the shift. Change when guard rotations would be briefly disrupted. 12 humans moved against 43 hegemony defenders in what should have been a hopeless battle. But the humans had advantages that couldn't be measured in numbers or firepower. Vexai watched through his recording equipment as the attack unfolded with terrifying precision. Kim Jin-soo's explosive charges detonated simultaneously at 17 different points around the facility, bringing down guard towers and creating gaps in the perimeter defenses. The humans flowed through these openings like water, each team member knowing exactly where to go and what to do. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes. When it was over, the supply depot was a burning ruin, and 12 humans were disappearing into the forest like ghosts. But even in the midst of total tactical victory, they had maintained their inexplicable humanity. Sergeant Kim Tae-won, the team's demolitions expert, had calculated his explosions not just to maximize structural damage, but to minimize casualties. Among enemy personnel, the blast patterns created escape routes for surviving hegemony soldiers, and the humans had deliberately left behind medical supplies and emergency rations for anyone who might need them. As they moved through the forest, during their extraction, Vexai struggled to reconcile what he had witnessed. These humans had shown mercy and ruthlessness in the same breath, treating individual enemies as people while pursuing strategic objectives that would ultimately result in thousands of enemy deaths. "How do you reconcile this?" he finally asked Lihana as they reached their extraction point. This contradiction between compassion and warfare. She was quiet for a long moment, checking her equipment one final time before the pickup shuttle arrived. Around them, her team was performing the same final preparations, their faces showing the exhaustion that came after successful completion of an impossible mission. "We don't fight because we hate what's in front of us," Lihana finally answered, her voice carrying a weight of experience that Vexai was only beginning to understand. "We fight because we love what's behind us." The extraction shuttle descended through the purple sky like a falling star, its stealth systems making it nearly invisible to enemy sensors. As the human team prepared to board, Vexai realized he had witnessed something that challenged every assumption about the nature of warfare and what it meant to be a soldier. The humans weren't just different tactically. They'd found a way to maintain their essential humanity even while engaging in humanity's most inhuman activity. They could show genuine compassion for individual enemies while pursuing strategic objectives with absolute ruthlessness. And somehow, this contradiction made them more effective, not less. As the shuttle lifted off into the darkness, carrying them away from enemy territory, Vexai understood that his observations were revealing something far more significant than unusual military tactics. The humans had discovered a way to wage war without losing their souls in the process. The supply depot burned behind them, its destruction echoing across 4 star systems as hegemony forces suddenly found themselves without critical supplies. But scattered around the ruins, hegemony search teams would eventually find medical supplies, emergency rations, and carefully written letters, explaining that their fallen comrades had been treated with dignity and respect. It was warfare conducted with a level of moral complexity that the galaxy had never seen before. and Vex High was beginning to realize it might change everything about how civilizations approached conflict in the future. The Grand Assembly Chamber of the Galactic Council stretched upward like a cathedral made of living crystal, its walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that reflected the moods of the 47 species represented within. At the center of the vast space, a holographic projector displayed images that had been keeping military strategists awake across the galaxy for months. Vexai floated in his testimony pod, his bioluminescent patches dim with exhaustion after 3 months of the most challenging observation mission of his career. Around him, representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy watched in stunned silence as he presented footage that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. Admiral Korthus of the Thalorian Empire leaned forward, in his command chair, his forearms gesturing with obvious agitation. The Thalorians had built their reputation on logical military doctrine and mathematical precision in combat. What Vexai was showing them defied every principle they held sacred. "Observer Vexai," the Admiral's deep voice resonated through the chamber's acoustic systems. "You've presented us with 3 months of combat footage, detailed psychological profiles, and tactical analysis that frankly disturbs our understanding of military science. Are you seriously suggesting that human effectiveness stems not from superior weapons or strategy, but from—" Vexai's tendrils curled in the gesture his species used to indicate deep uncertainty. In 73 years of documenting military conflicts across the galaxy, he had never encountered anything like human warfare. "Admiral, the data is absolutely conclusive. Human military success cannot be explained through conventional analysis of technology, numbers, or tactical doctrine." The holographic display shifted to show compilation footage from Kepler 44 to B. Lieutenant Kim Daeho appeared on screen, carrying a wounded Vorthok raider to the medical bay while his own soldiers lay dying around him.
Oh.
The image was so jarring that several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Humans possess 3 characteristics that make them uniquely effective in warfare. Vexai continued, his voice gaining confidence as he presented his findings. First, they find meaning in suffering, where other species see hopeless situations. As reasons to surrender, humans see opportunities to prove their worth to themselves and their communities. The display switched to footage from Station Omega 7, showing Captain Park Minseok calmly approving art supply requisitions while plasma bombardments shook the station around him. The contradiction was so stark that Councillor Zethmar of the Silicon Confederacy actually laughed, a sound like grinding metal. Second, Vexai pressed on. They maintain social bonds that transcend individual survival. Most species fight for territory, resources, or political objectives. Humans fight for abstract concepts like honor, duty, and love that have no measurable tactical value, but somehow make them more effective soldiers. The most disturbing footage appeared next. Sergeant Lee Hanna, writing condolence letters to the families of enemy soldiers she had killed, explaining that their loved ones had been treated with dignity before death. The silence in the chamber was absolute as representatives from species that had fought humans tried to process what they were seeing. Third, and most importantly, Vexai's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Humans refuse to let hopeless situations become truly hopeless. They maintain morale, creativity, and fighting effectiveness in circumstances that would break any other species psychologically. Councillor Therix of the Mentari Collective, whose peaceful civilization had never engaged in warfare, spoke up. With obvious concern, observer Vexai, "Are you suggesting that humans represent a greater military threat than we initially assessed? Should we be preparing defensive measures?" Vexai's recording equipment had captured thousands of hours of human behavior under the most extreme conditions imaginable. What he had witnessed challenged not just military doctrine, but fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligent life in the universe. "Counselor, I'm suggesting that humans are incomprehensible by our standards," he replied, his bioluminescent patches flashing in patterns that indicated deep philosophical confusion. "Every other species in this chamber treats warfare as a mathematical problem to be solved through superior technology, numbers, or tactical doctrine. Humans treat warfare as a moral challenge to be endured while maintaining their essential humanity. Implications of this statement rippled through the chamber like a shockwave. Military representatives from dozens of species had spent months trying to understand human combat effectiveness through conventional analysis. They had studied human weapons technology, which was impressive but not revolutionary. They had analyzed human tactical doctrines, which were effective but not unprecedented. They had calculated human industrial capacity, which was significant but not overwhelming. None of them had considered that the real weapon was something far more fundamental: the human capacity to remain human even in the most inhuman circumstances. They don't fight like any species we've cataloged, Vexa continued, calling up battle footage that showed human soldiers sharing food with captured enemies, while simultaneously planning attacks that would kill thousands more enemy troops. Most civilizations excel at either warfare or peace. We have warrior species like the Cronan Empire who are efficient killers, but show no mercy. We have peaceful species like the Mentari Collective who avoid conflict entirely. Humans have mastered the paradox of being simultaneously compassionate and lethal. The chamber's atmospheric processors worked overtime as representatives from oxygen-breathing, methane-breathing, and ammonia-breathing species all reacted with their version of shock silence. What Vexai was describing didn't just challenge military thinking, it challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligent behavior. General Thokron of the Vorthok Crystalline Legions, whose forces had been defeated at Kepler 442b, spoke with the bitter tone of someone who had experienced human warfare firsthand. Observer, my troops reported that human soldiers treated our wounded with medical care superior to what our own military provides. Yet these same humans had just finished killing thousands of our warriors with brutal efficiency. How do we classify an enemy who shows mercy and ruthlessness in the same battle? That's exactly the problem, General, Vexai replied. Human military behavior doesn't fit our classification systems. We can show genuine mercy toward individual enemies while pursuing strategic objectives with absolute ruthlessness. Wage war while somehow remaining humane warriors. The holographic display shifted to show the aftermath of human military victories. Instead of the typical scenes of occupation forces suppressing conquered populations, it showed human soldiers helping rebuild damaged infrastructure, sharing medical supplies with former enemies, and organizing cultural exchange programs between species that had been shooting at each other days earlier. Dr. Kethal, Council's chief military psychologist, had been analyzing human behavior patterns for months without success. Observer Vexai, every psychological model we've applied to human military behavior breaks down at some point. They simultaneously demonstrate the compassion of our most peaceful species and the effectiveness of our most warlike civilizations. This combination should be psychologically impossible. That's what makes them so dangerous, Vexai replied, and so incomprehensible. Every other species chooses between being good at war or good at peace. Humans have somehow chosen both. The silence that followed was profound. Across the galaxy, military strategists had been trying to counter human tactical advantages, develop weapons to match human technology, create strategies to overcome human numerical superiority. None of them had realized they were fighting something that couldn't be countered through conventional means. Their greatest strength isn't their capacity for violence, Vexai concluded, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that would reshape galactic civilization. It's their refusal to let violence define them. They wage war while maintaining their essential humanity, and that combination is unprecedented in our recorded history. As he prepared to submit his final report to the Council's classified archives, Vexai realized that the galaxy would never be the same. The humans weren't just another military force to be calculated, countered, and eventually defeated through superior strategy. They were something entirely new, a species that could embrace both mercy and warfare without losing their essential nature. The other species in the galaxy had spent millennia perfecting either the arts of war or the practices of peace. The humans had done something far more difficult. They had learned to be warriors without becoming monsters, to show mercy without becoming weak, and to find hope in situations that should have crushed their spirits. The title of his classified report read simply, Human Military Psychology, a Threat Assessment for Galactic Civilization. But as Vexai sealed the document and transmitted it to the Council's secure databases, he wondered if threat was really the right word. Perhaps teacher would be more accurate. The humans had discovered something that the rest of the galaxy had lost somewhere. In their evolution from primitive societies to advanced civilizations, the ability to wage war while remaining truly civilized. As the council session ended, and representatives from 47 species returned to their homeworlds to brief their governments, Bexa remained in the chamber, staring at the holographic displays showing human soldiers sharing meals with former enemies, building schools in conquered territories, and maintaining hope in situations that should have destroyed them. The galaxy had encountered many warrior species throughout its history. It had cataloged peaceful civilizations, aggressive empires, and everything in between. But it had never encountered anything like humanity, a species that fought like demons and loved like angels. Often in the same moment, the implications would ripple across the galaxy for generations to come, forcing every civilization to reconsider what it meant to be truly advanced, truly civilized, and truly alive in a universe where both mercy and warfare were sometimes necessary. In the depths of space, human colonies continued their daily lives, unaware that they had just been classified as the galaxy's most dangerous and most hopeful species simultaneously. They went about their business of growing food, raising children, creating art, and defending their homes with the same inexplicable combination of compassion and determination that had baffled observers across the stars. And in the classified archives of the Galactic Council, a single report waited to change everything anyone thought they knew about the strange species called humanity. The end.